Now today, this is a little maybe unconventional. Really, I'll tell you, the original plan for today was I wanted to more or less to have all of you, kind of, if you wanted to anyway, to share your data after we do a little review, and then we can kind of look at it and speak about it. And so I'm going to start. Okay, I can see, we've got, I guess, about 10 of you here now. So I'm going to start just by asking, I'm very well aware, obviously, that we had our first part to this workshop on Wednesday, March 31st, and then the very next day, Thursday, April 1st, was the day that the new province-wide lockdowns were announced. So, in the chat, if you'd like to just let us know. I mean, if anybody was anybody able to do anything with their team in the last 3 weeks? Yeah, Max says unfortunately not. Andrew says yes, and data was uploaded. Okay, that's great. So Andrew, I think I'm going to come back to you. Okay, Peter says no. Just let me know, right? Because you all. I'm going to share. I'll let you know in a sec. But I've put some fake data into my fake team, so I'm going to share with you what I have first. But okay, anyone else? I know Peter says no. I'll give you 30 seconds or so. No. Okay. All right. So as I said, that it would have been nice if if that lockdown didn't happen, and we could have maybe had some more of you share your data and so on. But so we'll come to Andrew in a little bit. And I know offline, I know I had a conversation with Andrew, and he said despite the lockdown, he had his team. They were doing some work, I don't know if it was Zoom or on one of the other online platforms, and so he kind of introduced this, this system to the team to get them to report and record. So we spoke last day. Oh, Wellesley here in Brazil. You return on Monday. Okay, all right. Well, I guess you didn't have enough time, Wesley, either. So that's okay. So we spoke last time about monitoring. So the first thing that I think I'd like to reiterate before we just get into the PowerPoint here is that ultimately, once things go back to something that looks like normal, and that means you're training regularly 2, 3 or more days a week, and you've got a competition schedule, you've got games. I mean, let's hope those of us that are here in Canada, maybe we might see something happening in the spring and summer this year. We're all kind of hoping for that. But once you get into that routine, okay, I'm just going to go ahead and ask. So, I've introduced you in this course to Sports Recovery Tracker, which is a system that can help you monitor training load and other metrics as well. But specifically, again, in this course, we've talked about training load. So does it make sense? And I'm going to say anyone can answer this, but does it make sense once you get back to normal into your training routine for your players to track and monitor their training load during the training that you have with your team only? Or does it make sense for them to track and monitor their training load every day? So that would include them monitoring what they're doing with your team, but also potentially other physical activity, whether that's workouts that they're doing at home, other school sports, maybe just other sports in general, club sports, maybe they play basketball or baseball or anything else. Does it make sense to just focus on what's happening with the team, or does it make sense to have a picture of everything that's going on? And I want to know your thoughts. Keep in mind, there may not be a right or a wrong answer to this. So Andrew says monitor every day, something I wanted to discuss and mention to the team. Now, Andrew, if you don't mind, Andrew, I can actually have you. I can allow you to speak, because I'd like to actually get your thoughts on this, because that's a very interesting point of view, that it makes sense to monitor everything that's going on with the athletes. So I'm going to allow you to talk here, Andrew. If you'd like to share with us, why do you feel that way? Why do you feel that it's important not just to monitor what's happening with your team, but to monitor everything that they're doing, even outside of the team activities. You there, Andrew? Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if maybe there's some technical difficulty. Okay, well, let's go back to the chat here. Let's see. Okay, where's my chat here? Sorry about this, guys. Okay. So Barry said it probably does make sense since wear and tear is cumulative across all activities the player is engaged in. Okay, that's another good point. Okay, Wesley says again, option 2, in addition to checking hydration. Andrew, let me fix that. Okay, let's give it a minute. Trying to keep up. Okay, everything but hard to ask players to monitor it. Yeah, okay. So let me see if Andrew's here again. Okay.
That's good. Could you hear me now, Richard?
Oh, I can hear you now. Yes, great. Okay, yeah. All right. And I'll just say, anyone else, you can click the raise your hand button if you'd like to speak, and I can actually get all of you to speak now. So okay. So yes, Andrew, I can hear you. So yeah, let me know your thoughts, please.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I guess my first comment would be that I'm dealing with non-elite players who are involved in more sport than just soccer. And so it's important for me to know, what other sports they're involved in, and also the extent to which they're pushing themselves in those other sports. So if I'm thinking going back in time, I've had players show up to practice who after practice have told me, I wasn't feeling great today, coach, because I had 2 hours of rowing at high school. And I'm looking at them saying, please tell me that before so that I can account for that in what I'm expecting of you and I'm demanding of you during training. And so what I've spoken to, what I've talked to the players I'm doing Zoom training now with is that what I want them to do is I want them to calendarize the other activities they're doing. As long as they're not, I'm not talking about, playing street hockey outside or whatever. I'm talking about a couple of players, for example, have gone on, lengthy runs, and I'm saying, okay, so track that volume, track that intensity, give me that data, and I'll input it into the system. But more importantly, let me know when you do that so that I can account for that when I'm trying to push you during online training. And then obviously, more importantly, when I'm seeing you in real life.
Yeah, and so it's an excellent point. I think it was echoed by some of the others. So overall, Andrew, I'll say, like, I agree, and I think because ultimately, as a coach, it is going to affect your players if they're doing other, physical activity throughout the week. And most of the time they are, aren't they, Andrew? Like, it's pretty rare that if you're coaching a youth team that the only physical activity they do is with you, right?
Yeah, and that's never the case.
It's pretty rare. And, of course, as they get older and you want, like, I'll tell you, in my course that I teach, I mean, it's a really, really key component for everyone to understand. If you're working with youth athletes, you do not want them to specialize in soccer early. Really, I mean, there's no evidence to show that the top level players, have had any benefit from specializing anything earlier than about the 9th or 10th grade. So we're talking, a couple of years of high school. That's when, more or less it makes sense to start cutting out other sports. But before that, absolutely, you don't want them to. So you want them to be doing lots of other exercise, lots of other sports. And, I think we can all understand that, of course, that's going to affect how an athlete recovers, and it's going to affect their physical performance. So if in your team you have a few, that haven't had as much training load throughout the week and a few others that do, it might change what you do with them, right, Andrew?
Yeah, yes, exactly. And I would say, more importantly, it also makes me think of the idea of individual periodization over team periodization.
Yeah.
And I guess the challenge that I would have is that I'm dealing at the rep level. But if I was a more competitive coach, I would be seriously then looking at how individual periodization could account for all the extra activities players are doing, notwithstanding the team periodization.
Yeah, so now I'm going to ask you, okay, because again, this is something that will come up, okay? So I'm going to give you like a simple like scenario problem, and maybe let me know, and Andrew can answer this, or if anyone else, as I said, just click the raise your hand button, and I'll find you and add you as a speaker as well. So in the event that you've got, let's just say it's one specific player who has added, you know, another 2 days a week, let's say, of high intensity exercise over and above what the team is doing, and you've got team training sessions. What can you do with that one player? You know that that one player has a higher training load throughout the week than the others. What can you do in your training with that one player?
Yeah, I can let others weigh in. I feel like I've talked enough already.
Yeah, sure. Anybody else?
If you're not getting answers, I can.
No.
So I would reduce the volume for that individual player. I would take them out of maybe some of the high intensity you know, work that the team was doing, and reduce the volume for that player. You know, alternatively, take them out of high intensity things and get them to do some lower intensity work, which wasn't what the team was doing. The challenge, of course, there is that if we're trying to improve communication amongst the team, then taking those players out isn't ideal. So there's a balance, obviously.
Yeah. So it's tricky, but you're absolutely right that most likely the easiest solution for you would be to decrease the volume for that player rather than the intensity. And the reason that it's easier to decrease volume is because simply it means that, you know, maybe you've planned some small-sided games and you want to do, you know, 4 repetitions, but for this one player you do only 3, right?
Yeah.
Now that's easier than trying to change the intensity, because changing the intensity means you have to sort of, I don't know, ask that player to do less. I mean, maybe you can make that player a neutral player. Maybe you can give them more rest breaks and so on. And I can tell you just an example, you know, something that you might see, and anyone who's had some experience, let's say at the college level or pro level, like this was something actually that I encountered with the Ottawa Fury, which was the last, you know, professional club that I worked with. We had a player that was recovering from ACL surgery. And he was about 10 months away from the surgery, so he was starting to get integrated into team training. But you know, more or less the doctor, the surgeon that operated on him, and the athletic therapist, and myself, you know, we're kind of monitoring these things, and so he was allowed to, like, he participated in training, in the warm up, in different passing exercises and things. Anything that involved contact, and most of the training actually, because we were using tactical periodization, most of the training was just on the field, you know, playing games, and typically, you know, 11v11 games. He played, but without contact, in the sense that nobody tackled him. So if there was ever any 50-50 ball, anything like that, you know, more or less the players would defend him and jockey him, but would not go in and tackle. So those are things you can do to decrease intensity, but those are harder to do. Like, it's harder to do that if you want to decrease training load than it is just to decrease volume. Take him or her, take that player out, have that player do less repetition. That is the simple solution.
Yeah,
okay?
It also feels like if you're asking players to do something in training which you wouldn't want them repeating in a game, that might also be a challenge.
Yeah, and again, you have to think that what you're doing there, especially because this guy was a central midfielder, so he was involved in a lot of the play, is that then it's, you know, it's not really realistic. You got other central midfielders and defenders that are normally, you'd want them to be physical, to tackle, to do all those things, and of course, you know, you cannot do that if they're near that player. So it's difficult to decrease intensity. It's much more difficult to decrease volume. And if you remember from last day, from 3 weeks ago, one of the things that I suggested was, if you ever want to increase training load for any of your training sessions, which of the 2 variables, volume or intensity, makes the most sense to work with if you want to increase training load? Does anyone remember? Yeah, Max?
I actually don't remember, but instinctively I would have to say volume.
Okay, so it's tricky, right? So remember, based on the formula that we have, so we've got rating of perceived exertion multiplied by number of minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Which one, like you can increase, or you can do something to increase rating of perceived exertion. That's intensity, right? So you can do something to increase rating of perceived exertion, maybe take it from a 7 to an 8 or a 7 to a 7.5. Or you can increase volume, which means maybe you add 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something. Which one of the two is going to impact training load more, volume or intensity?
Feels like a trick question, Richard.
Well, okay, I'm gonna draw it out here. So we got RPE. I'm just using my on the screen here. So RPE. Okay, let's say we're gonna go, as I said, we're gonna go from 7, and we're gonna try to increase to 7.5. So that's the increase in intensity that we could do. Or we're gonna go for volume. Maybe we're gonna go from 60 minutes. And then we're going to increase to 70. Okay. So you have a choice between one of those two to increase training load. Either you increase RPE by 0.5 or you increase volume by 10. Which one is going to have a greater impact on training load? Just based on the numbers, right? Like,
Based on the numbers, you would go volume.
so volume is going to have a greater impact, right? Now, go back to what we talked about with periodization, because this is really important, right? So the principle of progressive overload. Mm-hmm. And the whole reason why in the app we are trying to get you to think about your acute training load versus chronic training load. What happens when you make a very large increase in training load from one day to the next, or even from 1 week to the next? What happens to the risk of injury?
It increases.
It increases a lot, right? So if you're going to try to influence training load day by day or week by week, and you want to increase it, what's the best metric to play with then to give you smaller increases? You want to try to increase intensity or volume? What do you think?
Start with volume.
Well, but remember, if you increase volume, you're gonna make a larger increase in load, right? Do you want a large increase in load?
Gotcha.
Did you understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yeah. So which one would you go for? Would you increase volume or intensity?
So you'd start by increasing intensity.
Yeah. Do something small to your training, like
incremental.
Yeah. Change the conditions, change the size of the field, maybe decrease the rest period a little bit, right, Max?
Yep.
Yeah, so those little changes to intensity are going to give you kind of a smaller, more incremental increase in load. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And now, now we're going back to kind of the question that I posed to you, and I know Andrew, kind of answered it already, but let's make sure that we're clear on the rationale. Because what I said is this will happen once you start to have your players, tracking their training load in your training, but also for the other exercise that they do. What happens if you've got one player or even 2 or 3 or whatever, a group of players that has been doing more than the others? Okay, what do you need to do to your training with those players? And Andrew suggested, just to be clear, Andrew had suggested decrease volume. And the main reason I'm going to say that you want to do that, I agree with you, Andrew, but the main reason why is because it's easier to decrease volume for a group of players than it is to decrease intensity for a group of players. Max, do you agree with that? Or
absolutely.
Yeah, because how can you decrease intensity for a group of players and it doesn't affect the others? Can you think of a way? This might be a trick question, right? But yeah, like
very hard. But if you had if you were to use a joker per se, and you limit him or her to a specific area of the field,
yeah,
then you may impact their intensity, but a lot harder to do, as you're saying.
Yeah, it's harder, and yeah, so the joker, and just in case if anyone doesn't know the lingo, joker is another word for a neutral player, right? So you can make players neutral. You could do, like I said, with this guy. That was recovering from ACL, and you can tell the players not to tackle him and so on. So there are ways to do it, but it's difficult, and it kind of affects the others as well, right? Like sometimes. So it's easier if you've got a group of players for which you know you want to decrease training load. It's easier just to have them do less repetitions and adjust your training accordingly. Okay, so hope that makes sense. And I want to go back just to the concept of do you want your players to track their training load, only with your team, or throughout everything that they do? And I think almost everybody that I asked, I looked at the chat here, almost everybody that I asked, kind of said, well, it's better to track it, throughout everything that they do. But I want to go back because I just want to see, and again, there's no right or wrong answer here, right? But could you think of any advantage to having the players only track what they're doing with your team? And I can even phrase that question a different way, which is, are there any potential disadvantages to having them track everything that they do? And you're all allowed to speak now. So you can, if you want to raise your hand, make it more formal, or, just unmute yourselves and participate. It's okay. I want this to be more of a group discussion. Anybody, don't be shy.
I'll jump in if no one minds.
Sure.
There's a great risk in having blinders only to our activity, because I think was it Andrew that spoke before?
Yeah.
That spoke of, a young athlete comes off of, so it'll happen to us in the fall a lot. They've ran cross country for their school.
Yeah.
And because of their performance and their satisfaction with their performance, and because of adrenaline, they want to push themselves at training.
Yeah.
And because they're feeling good, their RPE may be a lot lower than what is actually going on, and they'll only discover that, I was going to say with age, but after the fact, so the next day or in the following days, in terms of, okay, maybe I've pushed it too hard. So we may have blinders in terms of, oh, we need to push them harder in our sessions, without taking into account the load that they're already carrying in.
Yeah,
what I would share.
So that is absolutely a risk. And it's interesting that you brought that up, Max, because as a player becomes, I would say, a little bit more mature, that part of that is age, but part of that is also, the coaching, the leadership they get, whatever. Then what will start to happen with RPE is it's going to start to get closer and closer to that true physiological response. What I mean by that is, if you have a player wearing a heart rate monitor, you can track what's actually happening physiologically. And the correlation between the heart rate data and the RPE data with more mature players, professionals or players that are older, players that are playing at a higher level, whatever, the correlation becomes closer. So typically, hopefully, eventually, because that example you gave, it's an interesting one, that maybe you've got some young kids and they're doing cross country, and in the moment they're feeling really pumped up, and so maybe they give you a lower RPE than actually it should be, right? Max, if I'm characterizing what you said correctly?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so hopefully over time, when they become more mature, then all of a sudden their RPE is, more closely matches what it really should be. But in any case, you're always going to run that risk if you don't look at the other, training load data. You're always going to run that risk that you may be pushing some players too hard, and of course that they're not going to get all the same stimulus maybe that they should get. Okay, so Max says absolutely, and Gonzalo says hard to monitor. Okay, all right, we got it. Okay, so I just want to go back to that question though. Is there any possible advantage to looking at the data only for your team? I just want you to just even think outside the box with it, even if you don't agree with it. Sometimes this is good, it's a good skill to have, to be able to argue both sides of a point. So is there any possible advantages, or is there any possible advantage to looking at training load data only for your team?
Well, if I'm looking just at the raw data of our team, and I'm saying it as if I do it consistently, which I don't, which is why I'm here. But when you have that multi-sport athlete, and he's pushing it, and he's coming off with RPs of, you know, around 5, 6, or 7. And in the same group, you have a kid, you know, he woke up just an hour before session, and he's saying RPs are like, yeah, same 4 or 5. I find the advantage of having the blinders in that situation would be like, well, you can challenge the one to give it some more, because you can actually compare the players among themselves without using the outside influences of their, you know,
so
multi-sport or lack thereof.
Literally, because you're saying blinders, it's literally like being blind to everything else that's going on, and so you can look at only, you know, what's going on in that particular session. And that was kind of where I was going with this. So I'm going to pose this, you know, Max or anyone else, right? Like, think of it this way. If you wanted to, because I know you gave an example of 1 day. So now when we go beyond just looking at 1 day, but when we start looking at 1 week or a longer period of time, you know, a cycle of several weeks or whatever, you know, if you wanted to go back and look at, you know, your plan, right? It might be advantageous if you only have data that shows you what happened with your training, rather than data that shows what happened with your training plus other exercise, because potentially it might give you a bit of an unclear picture about what happened only with your plan. In any case, this is like not an argument, but it's kind of a debate that I've had with some other coaches and stuff. Now, I agree with what everyone has said, which is that it's better to get players into the habit of using, you know, again, you know, of course you can use our program, it's free, and that's part of what you got from signing up. If not, you can find another way, but it's better to get players into the habit of monitoring their training load every single day, because that's the best way to get a clear picture of what's going on with the athlete. The only limitation is that it's difficult then for you to isolate what happened only with your training. Okay, is there a solution to that you can think of? I don't know if anyone's played around with Sports Recovery Tracker yet with the data. Can you think of a solution? Let's say you want to look at only what happened with your training and you want to exclude everything else just to look at your training. What would you have to do? Anybody? It's a good conversation with Andrew and Max here, but let me call a name out. How about how about Gonzalo? Are you there? I don't know if you're able to talk now, Gonzalo.
Okay, Richard, I'm here, but I'm on another call as well. So
okay, you're busy. Okay,
you guys, okay?
No problem, no problem. Okay, all right.
Hopefully I can participate a little bit later, right?
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Okay, all right. Yeah, so the question is, I'll ask it again. What would you need to do if you wanted to look at only your training and exclude any of the other data from other, you know, cross country, you know, high school sports, other workouts? What would you need to do? Peter, you there, Peter?
I'm here.
Oh, any idea?
Hey, Richard.
Hey.
So I guess the first question I would ask is, have you been collecting, like up to this point, have you been collecting data from everything else as well? Or are you putting constraints on the players where you're saying you're only reporting what you're doing in training?
Let's assume that you've had players reporting from their training with you, but also from everything else. So let's say you have all that data. What would you need to do? And I'm kind of hinting at, you know, because believe it or not, Sports Recovery Tracker allows you to do this if you want to. But what would you? Yeah,
and I'll be honest with you, I haven't looked at the app at all.
Yeah, that's okay. All right.
So I apologize for that. Yeah. But you know, one of the things that I wanted to mention, you know, we were talking about, you know, how could you see differences in your players and things like that. The thing that I was thinking of is you could also see from the players that aren't getting additional outside training, how is their rate of improvement compared to the players that have been getting outside training?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And of course you're looking at injuries as well, right?
Yeah. And this is where things become complicated, because it's, I would say it's very likely, and now that we're all learning about training load and we're learning about how intense training needs to be and everything, maybe this is going to change, but it's very likely. And again, this has been my experience. When I go out and test teams, most of the test results are very low, which means that the players are not fit. And if they're not fit, that means they're not training hard enough. So which are the ones that are going to be probably the most fit in any team, Peter? The ones that only play soccer, or the ones that play soccer plus other sports?
Oh, it's going to be the multi-sport players.
That's right, because they get whatever load they get from soccer, plus they're also doing cross country, and most of the time, again, I'm generalizing here, we have
Right.
to conduct studies to really be clear about this, but this is the point that I made in my overtraining myth articles, right, and my videos and stuff about it. But most of the time, it's those multi-sport athletes that are in better shape that get hurt less. Most of the time. Okay. So we're all speaking about this because we're, and it makes sense to be this way, but we're all kind of concerned that we don't want players to do too much. But, the other advantage is that, and I think maybe Peter, you're hinting at this, is that it's very likely that the players, if you look at everything that players are doing and you find players are doing a lot less, those are probably the ones that are doing too little. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think too, with the cross training, you're developing different muscle groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you're more resilient that way as well.
And you're training different muscles. You're also training different energy systems in different ways. So remember that soccer soccer is the best sport, right? I think we all agree on that. But one of the unique things about soccer is that you get a stimulus to all three energy systems: the aerobic, the anaerobic alactic, and the anaerobic lactic. Some other sports prioritize one a bit more than the others. A good example is hockey. And if I had to ask, we're in Canada here, except Wesley, we're all in Canada, right? So any of you, which energy system, Peter, you probably know this, but which energy system of the three is used the most in hockey? The aerobic, the anaerobic alactic, or the anaerobic lactic?
It's going to be the anaerobic lactic, isn't it?
Absolutely. And why?
Because you're only going for like 30-second, 45-second shifts.
And the intensity is pretty high in those.
Right.
Those 30, yeah. So there may be some breaks if there's a penalty or something, but if not, you're working at a very high intensity, 30, 35, 45, maybe 60 seconds at the most, and then your shift is over. And you get some recovery, but you certainly don't get enough recovery to completely remove lactic acid. So, and you will find this, I guarantee you, all of us in Canada, right, that if you have players on your team, soccer team, who play hockey, those ones are going to be very, very good at dealing with lactic acid. I would say most of the time, the ones who play hockey and soccer are going to be a little bit more resistant to fatigue. I don't know if Peter, if that makes sense to you or not.
Oh, absolutely. No, yeah. I get it.
Yeah. And so these are things that, you can start to quantify that once you start collecting the information. So going back to the question, just because I know, it's, or else we're going to run out of time here, but Barry gave a good answer in the chat. He said, because back to my question, which was, how can you look at only what's happening with your team and exclude the other information? Says, I would imagine there would need to be a way to categorize the training and filter out what you don't want to look at. So you're absolutely right. That's what you need to do. You can do it in Sports Recovery Tracker. And of course you can do it if you have, Beyond Pulse or Polar or one of these other systems. What you can do is you can just look at the data from the days you trained. So you can filter, you can cut out all of the other data, and you can look at just the data from the days that you trained. And that would then allow you to kind of isolate and zero in on just what happened with your training if you want to do that. But, and I think I'm glad to hear that most of us are on the same page about this, it's better for you to look at everything that's going on with players. It will absolutely allow you to identify if there are moments where you need to decrease the volume for some players. And then Peter, going back to what we talked about maybe, maybe you've got a group of athletes that has overall a higher training load, and you got another group that has overall lower. and maybe you also kind of know that that group that has a lower training load is also not as fit. What might you need to do with those players? They've got lower training load over the last month or so, and you did a fitness test, right? You did a yo-yo test with them, and those players also, you know, surprise, surprise, those are the ones that had a lower yo-yo score. What might you need to do with them?
Well, you'd have to go back and you'd have to start increasing the volume of their training.
Yeah. So you might, those are players that might need extra work, extra repetitions, maybe another little running workout at the end of training. Maybe, you know, maybe you give them some more homework to do, things like that. And this is like, and I know Andrew kind of used this term, which I hope, you know, we can kind of keep in our minds, individual periodization. Okay. It's the best way for you to get good results with all of your players is to start looking at them individually. Okay. It's very good to look at group averages and team averages. And a lot of times, you know, I understand, obviously, you know, most of us are working in an environment where you're the only coach on the field, or maybe it's just you and an assistant, and, you know, and it's part-time, and, you know, maybe you don't have the time or the resources maybe to give everyone an individual plan. But at least by starting to track this information, you can start to pick out who needs a little bit more and who needs a little bit less. Okay. So my advice to you, you know, again, what I wanted out of this initially was I wanted to have everybody kind of, you know, collect data, and then we could look. I know Andrew's got some, so we're going to get to him in a minute, and then I'll show you some of mine. Okay. But you know, whether it's now or later, whenever the lockdowns are done, whenever you can, get your players into the habit of tracking and monitoring every day, and get yourself into the habit of checking at least every couple of days, at least once or twice a week, because then that allows you to identify, is there anybody in my team that needs a little bit more volume or more intensity? Is there anybody in my team that needs a little bit less? And then that allows you to start individualizing the training, individualizing the periodization, and that's how you get really, really good results. Okay, so I don't know if there's any questions or comments just about that point. If not, then we'll move on. I'll give it another 30 seconds. Again, all of you are able to speak, so you can speak up if you'd like to, and if not, we'll move on. Okay, good. So this is just a brief review. Okay, what I've done is I've kind of cut out all of the major slides with each. Oh, here we go in the chat. Oh, Andrew's got to leave at 3. Oh boy. Okay, all right. Well, I wanted to see Andrew's data, so you know what? On that note, here's what I'll do, Andrew. I'm going to stop share here. We can maybe even do our review a bit later. And Andrew, what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to make you a panelist, which means that now you can share your screen. If you can take a minute to bring your data up on the screen, and let's have a look at it. Is that okay, Andrew?
Yeah, that's fine. My
Great.
apologies to the group. I've just got a vaccine appointment at 3:15. So
oh, great. Okay. All right. Good luck. So I guess you're familiar with Zoom, Andrew, and sharing your screen. I'm pretty sure you are. All panelists. Okay, here we go. All right. So I've changed the sharing options. Whenever you're ready, Andrew, you should be able to share your screen now.
Yeah.
Like
What do you want me to bring? You want me to bring what up?
Oh, can you bring up your sports recovery tracker? Your
Yeah.
account?
Okay. That's what I figured. I wasn't sure that's what you meant. Okay. Sorry, it's going to take me a few minutes.
No problem. No problem. Yeah.
Apologies.
Yeah. So what I did is I just I used my my fake team that has some of the names of the legendary players from Manchester United and AC Milan, and I entered training load data for about a month. So you know, not quite enough to really stimulate the acute chronic workload ratio, but a good way to look at, you know, 1 week at a time and all that. Okay, here's Andrew. Okay, great. All right. So I guess
Should I explain myself first?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So what I've been doing is working with various teams online doing Zoom training, and I've been doing that probably since September of last year.
Okay.
And what I've tried to do since Christmas probably is to try and periodize the training in terms of slowly increasing the intensity, following the steps that you talked about, but following steps that I've been reading about and talking about with other coaches in other courses. And so what I've just done is I've input data for 6 under 16 players who train twice a week, doing Zoom training, which is a combination of ball skills and strength training.
Sure.
And then and just doing that twice a week. And then, as I said, I think in the chat, I asked them last week after the first course, the first webinar, to start tracking other sports that they were doing, and hopefully this week I'll get some of that information back in that I can add as well. But anyway, this is two training sessions a week, Monday and Thursday, and more or less 45 minutes or so of activity.
Great. Okay, so now I guess the first question is, nothing was done in the last week though, right? Or not yet, right?
No, there was a session on Monday, but maybe I didn't add the data. So there was something on Monday, but I might not have added the information for that.
Oh, okay, yeah. Only reason I ask is because, like, if we look on the right here, so the average training load over the last 7 days, there's nothing there yet.
Okay, so that's my
So
mistake,
it could be that data is not entered. That's okay. So yeah, so now we won't worry about that for now. But if we look at the previous session, and keeping in mind now, I guess the question I have for you now. The previous session that you had with this team, was it everyone together, or did they kind of do their own thing, like their own workouts on their own?
Yeah, so every session here is individual players either in their garden or in their basement doing individual work.
Okay, all right. And so do you know, I guess, it's interesting to make sure, that we're aware of this when we're looking at this, especially with players doing home workouts and stuff. Do you think they all did the same workout? Or do you think that they each did kind of their own thing and it was different?
No, so they all do the same workout because I can see them all doing it.
Yeah.
What does happen though is that the load is often different for individual players based on whether they've had, gym in this cycle of school, or whether they've done other activities, or whether they've got some sort of niggling injury or something like that. So the load is often different, and therefore the intensity. Well, not therefore, but also the intensity, because they're not doing the exercise for the whole period. Yeah. But the bulk of them are doing 45 minutes of exactly the same work.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, so that makes sense, and I think that's kind of what we're seeing, right? Because if you look on the right, you've got a couple of players here where the load is pretty low, right? It's 100, less than 100. I mean, that's really low. It was probably a pretty low RPE there, right?
Yeah, and also the fact that they probably would have, they might have had an injury, or they might have had gym that day, and therefore they didn't do whatever it was.
Didn't do it, yeah. And then with the other ones, you've got kind of approaching 300, 400. So it's a pretty wide range, right? And so these are the things to keep in mind, right? That, like, if I look at this workout, I would say, okay, well, yeah, something stands out to me for sure, which is these couple of players on the end there. Their load was a lot lower than the others. And then you have to start looking at why, right? So why was it? Well, okay, it's probably, I guess you said, maybe they had an injury, Andrew. Maybe, they had some other work that they had done, exercise before. And so they came into this workout already fatigued. Now, you didn't specifically change anything for them though, right?
No, I didn't. So for example, the player at the end is going through a growth spurt and is having either Osgood-Schlatter issues or just knee joint issues, and is only doing the strength training. So that's halving the volume right there. There
you go. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so I guess, the advantage to using, recovery tracker, the advantage to getting into the habit of tracking and monitoring, performance, right, is that this gives you some way to quantify what's going on. So you can clearly see, right, you've got, players with double or triple the workload of others. And eventually, that's something that you have to keep track of. If that happens over a month, these players with the lower workload, probably are not going to see the same improvement. So Max has his hand up, and I think you still should be able to
to
speak, Max. Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Yeah.
I just want to start by thanking Andrew for sharing It's great, and I know you have to leave, and we'll get a chance to continue with you, Richard. But quick question for you, 2 questions actually for you, Andrew. Were you already in the habit of tracking training data, and how comfortable was it for you to use the sport recovery tracker, if I may ask?
Sure. So let me answer the first question first. So I started the RPE figures probably in November, December, based on readings I've been doing in another course that I've been taking, and also in conversation with Richard. And I've been doing that with a U9 group, which is fascinating, and also doing it with a group of U16 and U18 players. So with the U16 and U18 players, the RPE information seems fairly genuine. With the 9-year-olds, as Richard alluded to earlier, the moment one person says 7, everybody else says 7, but I'm still doing it just as an exercise because I want them to start thinking about the idea. So I had been doing the RPE information for a while. In terms of adding the information, it's not a problem. I mean, ideally, I'd like the players to be adding the information to the system. I did it myself, and once you've set up the profiles for the individual players, it's very easy to add that additional, every week or whatever, to add the information. What I would say is I'm training twice a week, so it's not like I have a huge amount of data to be adding. And as you can see, I've only got 6 players showing up regularly to Zoom training out of a team of 18. But that's because there's a number of issues why that is, but so it's not like I'm adding a ton of data. So ideally, I think, as Richard had said, you'd want the players to add their own information and train them to do that. But then in order for them to do that, I would suggest that there needs to be some motivation. There needs to be a reason why they would be doing that, and that requires a better understanding than I currently have of this system in order to give them useful information back. So I hope that answers the question.
Awesome, Andrew. Thank you very much for sharing and for answering my questions.
Yeah, great. And I'll just jump in that it's an excellent point that this really you kind of have to change the attitude, maybe the culture, the perception of players to get them to see the importance of doing this, and then get them into the habit of doing it. And I'll commend you, Andrew, because especially during this lockdown period and Zoom training and all that, it's about as hard as it can possibly be right now, because you're not face to face with anyone, and it's hard to even organize any type of training. So, and the other thing I'll tell you is please, I hope nobody thinks that this is something that it's like in the national team or in professional clubs, that it's like really easy to do and you get good compliance. I mean, I can tell you, for example, when I worked with the TFC Academy, I mean, it was a constant struggle to get players to report consistently. We didn't have sport recovery tracker. I did everything with Google Docs at the time, and it was a little harder to manage, but and the one thing I can tell you is that when I was with the TFC Academy is a perfect case study. I'm not going to name names of the coaches, but there was one coach who, in my opinion, the best out of the 5, the most organized, the most knowledgeable, the most professional. This guy had his players very, very organized and disciplined. Every single player reported all the time. They reported training load. They reported recovery. They did everything they had to do. I would give compliance reports to each coach. And if there was ever in the compliance report, if there was, players that were, they only reported 50% in a particular week or whatever, he would then communicate with them and get them back on track and do it. So this was a good leader that was able to influence his team. Some of the others, not so much. Again, I'm not naming names here, but that's the way it is. And that's, the academy from our professional club. So it's not that easy to do no matter what. But at some point, you have to try to, as I said, change attitude, change perception, change culture in your team. And eventually some of you are, working with a club or whatever, maybe in your team and in your club, right? To get them into the habit, to get them to buy in, to see the importance, and get them into the habit of doing it every day. Because this data, Andrew, this data is valuable, but it would be much more valuable, of course, if you had, your whole team and, more numbers and more data. Do you agree?
Yeah. And I would just maybe add one other thing, which is that what I did from the beginning is I I made this part of the attendance. So I'll take attendance, and as I take attendance, I then ask for the RPE number. So it becomes part of my sort of process, and attendance is a marker for me, is one of the sort of the important sort of, not values, but one of the things underpinning the team, and is that you should show up to training, and if not, you need to tell me. But as I'm taking attendance, I can also ask for the RPE thing. So it's just, I'm already stopping the players at the end of practice to take attendance, so the RPE thing just becomes an extra piece. If I had to hope that they were going to go away and do it themselves, I would just spend my time policing, and that's just not a good use of my time or theirs.
I agree. Yeah. And so it's, I know you're working with some players who are younger and stuff. So this is, definitely not easy to do. And I can tell you, for almost my entire career, that's exactly, what I did, more or less what you're talking about, taking attendance at the end of the day. I would have my clipboard with a spreadsheet for, and a column for each day of the week, and players' names on each row. And I would take their RPE and whatever other data I needed to take, and then I would go input it later. It is extra work. Of course, I understand it is extra work, and but in the end, if you want to get out of, remember what Yogi Berra said, which is, if you don't know where you're going, you'll wind up someplace else. If you want to take the guesswork out of planning training load and periodization and monitoring, you need to actually put that work in. There is no other way to do it other than that. So. Good. Thank you, Andrew. I know you got to go, so maybe I'm just going to ask Andrew, maybe if you can stop share, if you don't mind. Great. Thank you. Okay. And now, here's what I'm going to do. As I said, I'd like to quickly go through just the review, and then I'll share some of my data, and maybe we can finish up with a discussion on that. So here we go. Hope you all can see now. Okay. So just a quick review of what we spoke about, 3 weeks ago, okay? And anyone can chime in. So we talked about planning, right? And the fact that planning, it's not just a science, that it's an art. And remember that you always have to keep this in mind, that whenever you have a team that you're working with, and you want to design sessions for the aerobic system or the anaerobic system, I'll ask the group, is there one way to do it, or are there, hundreds of ways? Many, right, Max? You got it. Okay. So there's many different ways. And the basic idea here is that, no matter what, okay, there's always going to be an art involved with planning training. Keep that in mind. I know you've got lots of, good information about, at least to get you started, about how to plan training for the different energy systems on the field with the ball, etc. But it's an art. Don't ever have a one-track mind and think there's only one way, or there's only a few ways. And you have to have an open mind when it comes to that. Okay. So fitness assessments, very quickly, right? So this is where Yogi Berra really comes in. His quote: "If you don't know where you're going, you'll wind up someplace else." We spoke primarily with regards to fitness assessments. We spoke about the concept of validity and reliability. What does validity mean? You want to choose a test that's valid, so you need to understand validity. What does validity mean? Peter?
You want a test that's going to reflect what it is that you're looking to get, right? So if we talked about, for example, the Cooper test as opposed to the yo-yo intermittent test.
Yeah.
Right. So although both of them measure VO2 max, the yo-yo intermittent test is more closely related to the demands of soccer than a Cooper test. Which
makes it more valid, correct?
Right.
You got it. Yeah. And that's why, like, if you start getting into the literature, right, you're going to see that, there are validity studies that try to validate the use of one test over another. And that's how we know that the yo-yo test is a more valid predictor of performance in soccer than the Cooper test. That's a good example. There's other examples. So you want to make sure you have a test that's valid, that it measures what it's supposed to measure. And then reliability is the other one. So Peter, what does reliability mean?
So reliability would be more towards you're getting actual results that are measurable, and you can see that there's changes in the numbers, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's reliable in the sense that the data is accurate.
Yeah, so I'll just add to that. The key with reliability is if you conduct the test multiple times, do you get consistent results?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But
so,
I guess what I was saying is, when you look back and you test the athletes maybe a little bit later on, you can see that there's improvement there, rather than, like, for example, if you started your preseason and you did the yo-yo intermittent test, mm-hmm. but then you went to the Cooper test later on.
Oh, well, it's a different test. Yeah.
Your results aren't reliable.
Yeah. So if you do a different test, then forget about reliability. But even if you do the same test, you have to try to find a test which is reliable and control as many variables as you can in order to maximize reliability. And I'll go back to the yo-yo test just as an example before we move on, okay? Because this happens all the time, and if you don't think of it, you can get caught doing this too. You do the yo-yo test in the winter in January indoor, right? No wind, moderate temperature, turf, right? And what do you do the next time you do it in April? Where are you doing the test?
You're doing it outdoors.
You might do outdoor. It's freezing cold outside. It's
right.
windy, and I don't know. Right? It snowed today, right? So there's snow on the ground too, right? So do you see a problem with reliability there?
Absolutely not the same. I mean, it is the same test, but it's not the same test.
Yeah. So you want to, of course, you want to choose the same test. You want to find a test that has been proven to be reliable, and then when you do it multiple times, control everything that you can. Don't test speed one time on a gym floor, one time on grass, one time on turf, and compare the results. I mean, it's really not, it's just not, it's not ethical really to make comparisons between players. If, I know Peter's you're a teacher, or you're a principal, Peter?
I'm not that sharp. I'm just a teacher.
Oh, you're a teacher. Yeah. So imagine, you test your students, but I don't know. One time you test them in a nice quiet room, and the other time, I don't know, you have construction going in the background, and you only give them half the time, and you interrupt them, right? It's not really.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be very fair of you, right?
No.
Yeah. So we want to try to keep things consistent, because that's the best way for you to determine whether or not players have improved. So keep that in mind, validity and reliability. Okay, we can move on. Okay, training. Okay, remember that soccer is not running. Romario, it's a brilliant quote from him. And the key behind this quote and the the relevance of it is, we have to think of ways to train the energy systems in our practices. That's on the field with the ball, and preferably by doing what? Like there's drills and activities, and then there's games. Which one is the preferred method for soccer? Passing exercise or small-sided game? Which one is preferred, and why?
Small-sided games.
Is that Stephen?
It's Barry.
Oh, Barry, I'm sorry, Barry. Yeah, okay, I agree with you. Why are small-sided games preferred?
It simulates realistic game scenarios, and fosters a better sense of competition and intensity.
It's more realistic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know, Barry, I'm not sure if you were there on the first day, but if you look at the notes and everything like that, no, I'm sorry, yes, you were. You just you registered, but yeah. So remember the principle of specificity, right?
Yep.
So if you want players to improve their physical performance in soccer, then the best way to train to get those improvements is by playing soccer, right?
Correct.
That's the idea. So we got to keep that in mind, and it's a good quote. Soccer is not running. Okay, so you have to come up with soccer exercises, and the best type are small-sided games. They give you all the other benefits. There's decision making, there's tactics, there's technical demands, there's time and space demands. So They're the best. Okay, and finally, monitoring. Okay, of course, no plan survives contact with the enemy. What that means is that if you don't monitor what's actually happening, right? If you don't monitor it, then there's always going to be a chance that things did not go according to plan. You don't know unless you check what's happening. And that's why I said it's probably going to require you. I think some of you have already seen some of the challenges with using Sports Recovery Tracker or any other tracking system. The challenges are the same. You need players to comply. If they have a heart rate monitor, well, they have to wear it and they have to open their app and collect the data, and you have to comply too. You have to spend some time collecting data, looking at it, analyzing it. Again, I designed Sports Recovery Tracker to try to simplify that process as much as possible, but it still requires some work and some effort, and that's the way it goes. But why is it so important? Well, it's because, without monitoring, you're not so sure if everything has gone according to plan, and then you're just guessing, okay? So again, I'll move really quickly through this because we've already talked about it. That training load is the product of volume times intensity. Volume is the time in minutes. Intensity is RPE. Okay, we talked about a good training load, how to progress week to week and phase to phase. Well, a good training load, it's hard to say, but the game is the benchmark. If the volume is 120, that's because your intensity, your RPE was 10. I'm sorry, if the training load was 1200, that's because volume was 120. That's 90 minutes plus a 30-minute warm-up. Intensity was 10 out of 10, as high as it can be, and therefore training load in a high intense game would be 1200. That's the highest that it can be, okay? And everything is used relative to that, okay? This is what a week might look like in terms of, planning it out. Okay, I gave you the numbers here. These are all in your notes, right? So just keep this in mind when I show you my data, okay? And I'm just going to ask why. Why is it good for your week to look like that, to have kind of a wave-like pattern, higher and then lower? Why? I want someone to unmute themselves and speak to answer this question. Why is it important? Barry?
Well, the lower sections will provide an opportunity for recovery from the higher intense times. So
Absolutely.
You don't want back-to-back high intensities, because then the load would be too much, too long, right? So
yeah, remember, right, that how many high load days? I know it says intensity at the top. That's a misnomer, right? But you can, instead of intensity, you can just imagine that it says load. Okay, how many high load days can players handle in a week? Do you remember the number?
I think it was like 2 or something like that. Would be
2, maybe 3, but typically
Yeah.
2. And remember that one of those is a game, right? So
Yeah.
how many other days can you put throughout the week that are high? If you
Yeah.
have one game already.
Yeah, if you got one game, then one other day is going to be a high intense, really pushing them to the max, right?
Only one, right? Only one. And as you said, Barry, because you need recovery, you want as many days in between those 2 high intensity days as possible, correct?
Correct.
And that's why it needs to look like a, like a wave pattern. It has to look like that. If it doesn't, something is off, and you're just putting the risk of injury, higher than it needs to be. Okay. So there it is. Okay. And of course, then we talked about progressing based on the principle of progression, making small incremental increases. And Max, I'm just going to come back to you because I know we talked about this, because these are examples, okay, of how you can increase volume or how you can increase intensity, right? Which one, Max, if we want to increase load, which one is the preferred choice typically, considering this principle of progression? Is it better to increase volume or increase intensity if you want small incremental increases?
Can you hear me, Richard?
Yeah.
Okay. So instinctively, I thought increasing the volume, but as we should, to make it incremental, because the volume has a bigger impact, a bigger multiplying factor to the load. It's better to increase the intensity as you will increase it in smaller steps, and therefore prevent risk of injuries and and make it more progressive for player and groups.
Absolutely, that's the idea. Yeah. So I've circled these steps. So sometimes this is just a common mistake. It's why I kind of wanted to highlight it. It's a common thing that coaches do. Is, you know, they'll say, okay, well, let's just add another game, but by doing that, now you've added another 10 minutes or 15 or something. So sometimes what that means is that then, you know, these 3 steps in the middle are knocked out, and you're going from, you know, the small step at the bottom, you know, all the way up to the big step at the top. It means that you know, the acute chronic workload ratio gets thrown off a bit, and because of that, then the risk of injury just goes up. Doesn't mean you're guaranteed to get hurt, just means that the risk goes up. So something to, you know, to keep in mind. Okay, and then of course we did briefly discuss, you know, we got to move on, so we won't spend too much time on it, but, you know, a sample month where you can look at weekly totals. And I just gave you examples of, you know, how to increase the weekly total by 5% based on those small incremental changes. And maybe in week 4, you do a week where it's, you know, deloaded, or, you know, you take the training load down a bit, and then you can jump back up again on week 5, for example. Remember, it's an art, not a science. Of course, this is not the only way to do it. You don't need to memorize the numbers. You don't need to memorize anything. You just need to think about conceptually what we talked about. And then, of course, not just week to week or cycle to cycle, but phase to phase, that it's the non-linear periodization model, which allows you to train each energy system every week. Why do we want to train all 3 energy systems in every week in soccer? Why?
Because they're all part of the game.
Mm-hmm. You are not ever in soccer going to play a full game and not use all 3 of these energy systems. They're all important. If you neglect one or ignore one in training for too long, what happens? Well, the system starts to decrease in capacity. You don't want that in soccer, because you need all 3 systems to function at a high capacity. But what you can do is shift the focus a little more to one versus the other. And I think, you know, I gave some examples of how to shift the focus. If you have 3 practices a week, maybe in one phase or one cycle, 2 are aerobic and 1 is anaerobic. And then in the next phase or the next cycle, same 3 practices, 2 are anaerobic, 1 is aerobic. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's a way that you can do it. And this is the way that, you know, that I did it at the pro level, and you can certainly do it, you know, with your teams as well. You don't ignore one system, you just adjust focus, and of course you can make small incremental increases in training load from one phase to the next as well. Okay, this is what we track in Sports Recovery Tracker, the acute chronic workload ratio. I'm gonna just highlight something before we look at my data, which is, in order to calculate chronic workload, you need a long time. Okay, we're taking actually the average between, you know, 21 to 28 days. That's a month. So without that, you can't really look so much at the ratio, but you can look at training load. Okay, and remember, you know, this is what it is. But in order for you to get really meaningful data, I know this workshop was only 3 weeks between when we started and when we finished, and of course, you know, we had a lockdown, so we didn't get good data. But you know, really, to get good data, 3 weeks is not enough. You need several months, and you need to start tracking it. And that's why I said you have to change the attitude, get your players disciplined, you know, change the culture so that they buy in. And, you know, or like Andrew, you're going to have to change your own habits and go and collect the data yourself. So, you know, you have to do that. If you don't, then you're not going to get any data. So, okay. And of course, Recovery Tracker, as I said, it also tracks all of these other metrics. That's not the focus of this course, of this workshop. So we're not speaking about it, but you can track recovery, hydration, and injury status as well. So with that out of the way, finally, here is my sample data, fake data, okay, from my fake team of Manchester United and AC Milan legends. And also there's snuck in here is the name of my partner in Sports Recovery Tracker, who's also a member of in the National Soccer Coach Association of Canada, Sam Blakely. Maybe some of you know him from Niagara. So he's the web developer that developed it. So he put himself in there too. So we have a bunch of legends, and then we have Sam as well. So I want to ask, I'll open this up to the group, okay? You can see the average training load over the last 7 days. What stands out to you? Is there anything that stands out to you? we're looking at first the graph on the right before we deal with kind of the bar graph in the left. What stands out to you here?
So the assumption is, sorry, I'm jumping in. The assumption is that we play on day 7. And
So yeah, on this graph now, this is the last 7 days. So it's a little tricky because it's Wednesday today.
yeah,
So actually, what you've got from this is you know, it's a picture of the week, but it's the last 7 days. So I did enter fake data for today, where the training load average was 600, and then there was which one do you think represents the game? I mean, I've kind of given it away, but
right.
you can kind of tell anyway. Which one of these days is the game, do you think?
So the game day should be on day 4.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And how do you know that, Max? Just from the numbers, right? Like not because I told you that we use Wednesday as the cutoff, but how do you know?
But because the game is where the load is the highest, and
Yeah. And why is that?
because we're gamers, we don't like to train, we prefer to play.
All right, so that's true, but also keep in mind that it's because of the volume, right? Like the game is 90 minutes, and the intensity is typically 9 or 10 out of 10, right? Like it's very rare that you're going to have a player play a full game, and you can try this and you'll see, right? But once you start collecting RPE, you're almost never going to get a player who played a full game and gives you less than a 9 out of 10, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's possible, but it's highly unlikely, right? So when you look at a week, because this is the way the app works. So if you look every Sunday, then you're going to see obviously the game on the left, and it's going to be day 1 or whatever it is, and then again on day 7 or day 8. But if not, you're looking in the middle of the week. Now we know that was the game. So does it make sense then, Max, that the average was close to 900? Does it make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, because we're talking, and again, I kind of just did this, 90 minutes,
Times
10 out of 10
yeah.
intensity for almost everybody. I think I made the goalkeeper, Peter Schmeichel, his workload was a bit less. You can see it there. And, you can see obviously Roy Keane, who's the hardest working out of all of these. Maybe Gattuso give him a run for his money, but other than that, Roy Keane is the hardest worker, and his is higher. So in any case, so we know that the game is in the middle of the week. So based on what we've learned now, okay, what happened to training load on the day after the game? Max, you can answer, or anybody else, feel free.
I'll go for it. I feel I'm on the
Yeah.
roll. So the day after is basically a recovery day. So the load is minimal, not to say non-existent.
Yeah.
I don't know if you bring them in for a recovery session, but they're definitely not. RPEs are very, very low. So
yeah. So RPE and also volume. So this is sort of pattern after, again, what I sort of looked at what I did with the Ottawa Fury, which is, as I said, the last pro club that I worked with. So essentially it was fairly standard. We had a 30-minute session. We're talking about the players who played, mind you, not the ones who didn't, because the ones who didn't, then they had their own workouts to do, and that's also why Max, and everybody really, it's very important. You have to look at team averages, but you also have to start isolating players. And this is one thing I would definitely advise you to do is, if you've got players that are consistently playing games, 90 minutes, and others that are either substitutes that are only getting a little bit of time, or not playing on the bench, you can't just look at team averages. Then you have to start separating those groups, right? Because or else the averages are not going to give you the full picture of what's going on. So in any case,
sorry,
yeah.
Richard, just to jump in, and the app provides for that.
You can do that. You can look at your team as a whole, or you can filter to look at only specific players.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay. And that's it's kind of a important feature to have, right? Okay. So in this particular session, this was patterned after what I've done a lot of times, as I said, with the players who played. It was 30 minutes. There was some cardiovascular exercise, then some stretching and mobility, and then they went to go do ice baths or treatment or whatever they needed. So it was 30 minutes, and typically the RPE, I think I gave an RPE of about maybe about 3. So that's why you're seeing training load about 100. 30 times 3 is 90, or, or 4, so that's the reason why the average training load on the day after is so low. And it makes sense, right? Because again, that gives us that wave-like pattern. That's a recovery day. Okay, so now what else kind of like stands out to you, or do you see that sort of makes sense based on what we've talked about in this workshop? Anybody else? Barry?
Yeah, what I see is the day before is another relatively low or pretty low training load day.
Okay.
And that would really be for the purpose of conserving and basically getting those energy reserves built up to as high as they can for the game.
Absolutely, right. And again, this is keep in mind, I mean, this is pattern after a professional club that trains every day. Some of you maybe in the university environment, you're also training every day, but if you're coaching club teams and stuff, even when we go back to out of COVID or out of the restrictions, you might only train 3 days a week or whatever. But it's possible, that you, even within those 3 days, you might have a training session that's the day before the game. Maybe that's the only time you get your field or whatever. The training load has to be lower because you know that the game is going to be high. Okay, so this was, again, it was based on a standard, protocol that we had on the day before the game, which was that training was 45, maybe 60 minutes. And the RPE was also typically very low. And that's why you're seeing, average between 200 to 300. It has to be low. It's not quite as low as recovery, because recovery days were only 30 minutes, but it's not that much higher. Okay. You don't want to have a high or even a moderate training load on the day before a game. You want to have, a low training load, because that gives you enough time to recover. Okay. So good that you picked that up, Barry. Now there's one other thing, and I just want to draw our attention to it. I'm going to circle so we can call these, like, this is, maybe you've heard the I guess, the parlance is the way, or the manner of speaking. Match day +2 and match day +3. Okay, so I can be like an artist in here. So that's match day +2 and that's match day +3. What stands out to you, if anything, about that period of time, 2 days after the game and 3 days after the game? What stands out to you, if anything?
To me, it speaks of starting to build back up or continue the training in those different energy systems to continue to build them.
Okay, and why do you need to do that?
For continued improvement, to maintain your capacities. Yeah.
So you have to be conscious that, like, the only, like, and mind you, you look at match day +3. That's the highest other than the game, right?
Yes.
There's no other day that actually, no other day that really even comes close, because you've got the training load on average is 100 points higher, right? So why is match day +3 the highest load other than the game?
It's probably the furthest number of days away from the next game.
That's right. It's the only way to give you that interval of time. I mean, more or less, like if you're playing games on Sundays, then the next highest load day it's probably going to be Wednesday or Thursday.
Yeah.
Maybe Tuesday, but you only have those couple of days to play with, right? So that's a day where you have to be conscious of that. So going back to this, the linear periodization model, which allows you to train all 3 energy systems in the same week. Okay, if I had to ask you, Barry, and remember, there's no right or wrong answer, but, well, there is something that's definitely wrong, but there's a couple of things you can play with. So which energy system do you think the focus is on match day +3? Aerobic, anaerobic, alactic, or anaerobic lactic? Which one?
I would probably lean towards one of the anaerobic ones, probably the lactic.
Okay, so we're saying it's definitely not the anaerobic alactic, right?
I would think so, yes.
So I agree with you, because anaerobic alactic training, typically the load is not very high, right?
Right,
It can't be, because you only sprint for 5 seconds at a time or whatever. Like you can't really do a high training load day if it's all alactic.
Right.
It's counterintuitive, right?
yes,
You're going to run out of creatine. We're not getting into all the physiology, but you're going to run out of creatine, right? So the high load day is either going to be anaerobic lactic, or what other option could it be?
or aerobic, I guess.
Or
yeah.
aerobic, right? And remember that with aerobic training, typically the volumes are higher, right?
Right,
Because you got to play intervals of 2 minutes or 3, so it's quite common that with aerobic training, your overall training load is going to be high because your volume is high. But what about intensity, RPE, with aerobic training? Sometimes is it really, really high?
you said with aerobic?
Yeah.
Probably with aerobic, it would be a little bit lower, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's still going to be high, but it might not be
Yeah.
maximal. Remember, you can go back to your notes. Like, we've got this in the notes, so please, I hope you don't think I'm, testing you on this. And like, but if you go back to the notes, the PowerPoint slides, that a good target RPE for aerobic training is between 7 and 8. So that's high. It's high intensity. Soccer players should not be training at low intensity unless it's a recovery day. It's still high, but it's not maximal, right? Maximal is 9 or 10, right?
Yes,
And that's the key. Now let's talk about the lactic system, okay? That the volume with the lactic system, it's higher than the alactic system, but it's not as high as the aerobic system, is it?
yes, I would say so.
It can't be, because
Yeah.
with the lactic system, you're only working in intervals of 30 seconds to a minute max.
Right,
So with the aerobic system, you might be working in intervals of 4 minutes or 5 minutes, right?
right.
So the
Yeah.
volume is going to be lower, but what about the intensity now, the RPE?
Well, now you're trying to push that intensity up into the 9s and 10s.
That's right. And most often, if you do a hard, speed endurance is another name for it. And I think I gave you some examples last day, right? But if you do a hard anaerobic lactic session, you're very likely to get an RPE of 9 or 10. Okay. So back to this question, match day +2 versus match day +3. Maybe match day +2 was anaerobic lactic and match day +3 was aerobic, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe match day +2 was, aerobic and match day +3 was anaerobic lactic. Or maybe they were both aerobic, and maybe this session here, you can call it match day +5. Or, some people also like to call this match day -2, and, whatever works for you. It's not, I'm not, I guess, I don't know if, Andrew is gone, but maybe I think Peter knows about Raymond Verheyen as well. I'm not going to be as dogmatic as Raymond Verheyen and say you have to say this and that, and if you don't, you're not using objective football references. You use what works for you, whatever makes sense. But in any case, maybe this was the day, match day +5, that was anaerobic lactic. Or maybe, +5 and +3 were both anaerobic lactic because you're in a different cycle, whatever it is. But you understand that that's kind of the idea with the energy systems, okay? That for sure, you cannot have more than 2 high load days in a week, maybe 3, but that's pushing it. And within those, 2 days, you want to have in between them as much, low or moderate load days as you can, because that gives you recovery. And this is more or less is the way it's going to end up looking when you do that. There really isn't too many ways to make it look different, because if you do, then it means you've probably got something wrong. Okay, so that's good. I just want to now let's draw our attention to the graph on the left here now. Okay. Is there anything that stands out? And keep in mind, this data was fake data, so it might not always line up like this. But what stands out to you, from this high intensity session that we did today with the legends? What stands out to you?
Just Richard, would that be day 2, the reference from day 2 on the graph?
So this is the previous session, and so the previous session is the last one that was entered. So this is actually
okay.
So we can call this one match day +3 on the left. That's what it is. So anything stands out to you there? Or?
Well, aside from Roy Keane pushing it extra, which
Yeah.
which may mean that, you know, he felt bad about the game, or he wants to
Yeah,
make
yeah,
sure he gets on the starting 11 for next game.
yeah, yeah.
We also see that the goalkeeper's load is lower, but
Yeah.
that's probably normal per the position, and everyone else seems to be fairly the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah, so it's just an idea, and I agree with you. And I see Peter raise his hand, so maybe Peter, if you have anything to add.
No, the only thing I was wondering was, you can see from, you know, the majority of players, everybody's volume is the same.
Mhm.
And just as you pointed out, Peter Schmeichel's is lower, Roy Keane's is so much higher.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was wondering was, if everybody's volume is pretty much the same, then everybody's done the same amount of work. Roy Keane has obviously worked harder.
Everybody's load is the same. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So my question will be, well, why is Roy Keane working so much harder than the others?
Yeah, that's a good point. So, and these are the things that unless you're monitoring, you are not going to pick out, Peter, right? So
Right.
why? Now, you know, I don't know, and I think Max suggested maybe he was just, you know, he was benched in the game and he's upset, and so he's just really working hard, you know, to try to earn a starting spot. Maybe, you know, he was in the particular session, he had a role that, you know, I don't know, someone else got hurt. Maybe Ferdinand got hurt, and so Roy had to do double the work, or right? Maybe he's in a phase where he's recovering from an injury and he's being asked to push himself more, right? We don't know, but this you know, I kind of wanted to show you, just because this is the way it's going to look. It might not look, you know, this obvious, right? Like it might not come out that every single person, you know, was whatever, you know, 650 average, and you know, the goalkeepers are typically going to be lower. That's very common to see that. And sometimes you're going to see some players higher, you know, but it might end up looking more like that, you know, some higher, some lower, etc. But in any case, why? Obviously, you know, this is fake data, so you know, we'll never know. But in the case of your own team, Peter, then that's when you have to start looking at why, right? So the real value in collecting this data isn't just looking at the graph. The real value is then allowing you to dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, what's another possible reason why his load was higher, Peter? Let's say everyone did the same practice, so you know the volume was the same, right?
Right.
Why would his physiological response, RPE, be higher? We talked about, okay, maybe he just pushed himself more. That's one reason. What's another possible reason?
Well, the first thing I was thinking of is maybe his conditioning isn't as high as the others.
All right. And that would lead him to a higher RPE. Why?
Well, because his rate of perceived exertion is higher than the others.
Yeah. So everybody else did the same work that he did, but he found it a lot more challenging, right?
Right.
And that means probably his conditioning is not good. Now, I'll tell you, in my trainer's course level 2, when we start, this is the real advantage of having technology. Okay, and we teach this in the level 2 course. That's why I'm saying it. But that the way that you can determine whether that is the case or not is by looking at the data that you can get from GPS or accelerometers. So essentially, if Keane's RPE, or if he had a heart rate monitor on, if his heart rate was high, but he did the exact same running as everybody else, he didn't run any more than they did or faster than they did, what does that tell you about his fitness?
Well, his fitness is lower because he has to work harder to produce the same results.
His physiological response was greater than everyone else despite the same relative amount of running. Now, on the other hand, if his physiological response was higher, right, his RPE was higher, but he did an extra 30% running than everybody else, he literally worked harder than everyone, then what does that tell you about his fitness level?
Well, it tells you that he's fitter than everybody else.
Yeah, because in the same practice, he was able to get more work done and push himself.
Right.
Now, unfortunately, this is the one limitation to our product, is that you don't necessarily know, how much distance players cover and how many sprints they did from only looking at RPE and volume. Okay, so it's unfortunate. It's one of the the main limitation, to be honest, of tracking training load in this way. The only way that you can do that is with an accelerometer or GPS that measures position, right? Okay, but that's expensive, and this one is free, so that's why we've done it. Yeah, Peter, hand up.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about, Richard, and I don't know if this would bear any credence, but you talked about Peter Schmeichel and his results being lower because he's the keeper, but you're probably going to see a difference in players according to position, are you not? Like the midfielders are going to be much fitter than, say, the center backs.
It's very likely, yeah, and that's why, yeah. So you're right about that, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Oh yeah, but keep in mind, it's also possible. Like it's tricky, right? Because that's why, I mean, if the midfielders are fitter, then what you might get, you might get lower RPEs for them, right? Because maybe, again, everyone did the exact same type of session, and therefore they weren't challenged as much. But sometimes, and maybe, again, Peter, I'll just build on this idea, which is that this speaks to the concept of tactical periodization. If you do it, if you do a model like that, where almost everything you're doing is more, a lot of 11v11, a lot of larger numbers, then is everyone going to do the same amount of work in an 11v11 game, Peter?
No, absolutely not.
So in that case, it's possible that you get the midfielders actually doing a lot more work, and maybe their RPEs go higher.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky, but that's also why I think it's really important when you do see any changes in RPE or differences between players or whatever it is, that you start to look at why. Like, why is it? Because if not, you're not getting the full picture. Okay, so Barry, hand up.
I think what it gets down to is understanding the context of the numbers as well, right? And remembering, or because some of those things you don't document, right? You don't record, well, this person played midfields and they played 60 of the 90 minutes, right? You're not necessarily recording that, but it's the context of, why is this high? Well, I'm remembering that this player played 60 of the 90 minutes, worked really hard, played midfield central role, worked, and did that, right? Other players, they're subbing off more frequently for rest or whatever, right? So it gets down to numbers are great, but it's also the context that surrounds them, because really, and just by going through this brainstorming scenario, right, you've come up with like 3 or 4 different scenarios as to why Roy Keane could be having a higher training load, right? But without the physical or visual observation to put that into context, you're really just guessing, right? A number is just a number without the context behind it.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'll tell you, it's a great point, and I mean, like I'm a sports scientist and I do this stuff all the time, but I'm also a coach, and I'll never say, and I hope this message is clear as well, as that I'm not at all suggesting that all you need to do is look at the numbers, and the numbers are going to tell you everything. First of all, again, we kind of talked about the idea that of course you have there's some limitations with this particular product, that if you're not measuring the amount of running and the speed of running, you're missing out on part of it. That's context that you don't have, that you can measure. And then of course there's lots of things that you cannot measure. Sorry guys, long distance call coming in here. Okay, so that's context, and then as I said, there are things that fall under the category of context that you cannot measure, right? And I'll throw another one out there, which is that what about the psychological state of the player? Is it possible that Keane is having a bad day or a bad week? Okay, so the idea is that what this allows you to do first and foremost is to identify outliers And by identifying the outliers, now the best solution, I'll tell you right now, and this is even again in the pro game or whatever, you know, the solution or the next course of action, let's say, after you identify, what do you think I did? Did I just go in my spreadsheet and say, oh, okay, coach, you know, we need to change this, this? Or what else might I have done, do you think? If I've identified some outliers that, you know, their load is higher than everybody else.
Well, it gets down to the questions of why, right? Probing.
So what do you need to do in order to determine why?
Well, you need to talk to the player. You need to talk to, in the case when we deal with youth, you know, find out from parents, hey, has he been having a tough time at school, or something happened with the family, and that kind of stuff. That's, like you said, if it's psychological, you may not necessarily see it. I mean, you might get a sense just because of demeanor in that, but you know, especially with boys, they may not necessarily be all forthcoming to speak out of what they're feeling, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's really going deeper and taking that coach player relationship to the next level, and caring about them as an individual, right? And getting to the bottom. I mean, as much as we're training them for soccer, it's also, you know, life skills and how to cope and different things too, right? So.
Yeah, so you literally, as you said, you speak to the players, and if you're dealing with youth, you speak to them, but you got to speak to their parents as well, to, you know, to try to identify why. And this was, it's funny that again, I keep referring to the Fury just because it's most fresh in my mind, but I could even be speaking about my work in Uruguay. That's the pro club I worked with before the Fury. Both of those clubs, okay, we had no access to technology, so everything was done using a system like this, but I just used, as I said, spreadsheets and whatever. And so the most important thing, I mean, I never forget the conversation that I had with, you know, the head coach of the Fury at the time, Nikola Popovic. He was very big on tactical periodization and not so big on you know, traditional fitness training, for example, conventional fitness training. And we were looking into some of these softwares, and really the club couldn't afford any of the software, but we were kind of looking in to see, is there anything we could use? And one of the conclusions that he and I came to was, look, like the most important thing isn't even the software or the data. The most important thing is having conversations with players. Okay, you want to have some numbers, you want to be able to quantify it. And I see, you know, the point that I think Max made in the chat here. Imagine without any data, right? Yeah, and you're right, Max. Without any data, you're working blindly. And you don't want to work blindly, right? You want to have data, but you cannot look at data and think that it tells the whole story. You have to have conversations with players. And I think that that's an important thing to always remember. So I saw a couple of you raise your hands, and I just didn't quite see what was Barry, and I don't know, Max had his hand up, or?
Yeah, I just think Barry made some really, really good points. First about, you know, once you look at the data, there's a ton of directions you can interpret it. Yeah. And then, as you were saying, it's the outlier allows you to start the intervention.
Yeah.
And I think you and Barry were both making the point, well, the intervention begins with a conversation. But that makes me cycle back to my original comment. So I've been coaching for the better part of the last 20 years. And when I think about the things I was doing 20 years ago, it just makes no sense to me, because everything was a guessing game.
Yeah.
You took no data. It was just all my feeling, all what I remember from my playing days and this or that. But yeah, even with the data, now you have questions that come up that you didn't even pay attention to when you didn't have the data.
Yeah, so I agree, and again, it's actually, to be honest, Max, I could say the same thing about my own, you know, coaching, and you think back to what you did 10 years ago or 15, or if you think back to how you were coached and, you know, when you played, right, if it was long enough ago, and yeah, you know, nobody was doing this, so yeah, unfortunately there was a lot of guessing. Sometimes you guess right, but a lot of times you don't, and I would say that, you know, of course, you know, data, it doesn't tell you the whole picture, but it does at least allow you the opportunity to get, you know, a more clear picture of things. So in any case, you know, keep that in mind, and let's because I can see it's 1:45. I'd like to wrap it up when we get to 4 o'clock. I mean, we could stay. I could talk about soccer forever, but I got to be fair to all of you as well. So this is, I just wanted to kind of finish with this, and then I'll show you just an example of what you get with an individual player. So this is the acute chronic workload ratio. And remember that in order to get a little bit more meaningful or valuable data out of this statistic, you need a greater amount of time to get more chronic workload. So keep that in mind. But, you know, as I said, before we wrap it up, I wanted to present this to you. If you remember, you can quickly go back to your notes or whatever. Do you remember what I mentioned as the optimal range for this number to be? And again, this is the ratio between the acute workload, that's the workload today, or the training load today, and the chronic workload, which is the average over a 3 or 4 week period. What was the optimal range? And, you know, hint, hint, you might see the numbers right in front of you here. So with my fake data. So. Anybody?
I actually don't remember.
Oh, okay. Well, if you go back and check, then what you'll see is that the optimal range was between 0.8 and 1.5. Okay, what that means is that, you know, go back to Max, we were talking about principal progression. What that means is that you haven't done anything acutely, right? From one day to the next or week to the next, you haven't done anything acutely that's thrown or that's increased training load too high to the point where it throws this ratio and makes this number, you know, bigger than, you know, more or less bigger than 1.5 or bigger than 2. And you can kind of see, you know, I guess you can see like where, you know, do all of my numbers with my fake data, do they all fall within that range? What do you think?
Yeah, relatively.
More or less, right? Yeah. So you can see, if anything, you know, it trended downward a bit. And keep in mind, this might happen. This is just because when you start on day one, you don't have any, you know, chronic workload. So you're starting from, you know, from 0 or whatever. And so in any case, it takes some time to put data into the system in order for it to really get going. But in any case, more or less, the acute chronic workload ratio has stayed more or less stagnant. And that's not a bad thing. Okay, it can go up a little, it's okay, but more or less, if it's staying stagnant around that number of 1, that's ideal. That's what you want. Okay, I just want to ask, you know, the group, like, are we clear on this? Do you have any questions about this? Or does it make sense that this is ideal what you're looking for? Does it make sense? Or does anyone have any questions about it?
So you said the optimal range is between 0.8 to 1.5?
Yes, 0.8 to 1.5. Yeah.
Okay. And the idea here is the average of the last 21 days.
Mm-hmm.
So the days session divided by the average of the last 21 days should
Exactly.
be around 0.8 to 1.5.
Does it make sense?
I honestly don't begin to understand. So we're measuring the training load, right?
Yeah, so remember, it's all based on the training load numbers, right?
So the average of the team?
So this is team, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we looked at the graphic before, we had an average of 600, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're saying the typical day would be either 600 over an average of 600, or somewhere between 0.8 to 1.5. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So what that means is that if your average over a longer period of time, right, over that last 21 days, right, if your average over that last 21 days was close to 600 and your training load today was 600, then what's the ratio going to be?
Close to 1.
That's right. You understand?
Yeah.
It can be a bit higher. It's okay. That's why I said, like you know, if it's a full straight line, maybe that's not the best thing, because eventually you want it to start going up, right? But because we're factoring in that chronic workload, we're factoring in a long period of time. If the number goes too much higher than 1, you know, 1.5 is okay. But if it starts to go too much higher than 1, then what you end up getting is you end up getting an increased risk of injury, because it means that whatever you did on that particular day is a little too high relative to what your players are capable of doing. Does it make sense?
I'm starting to get it.
Yeah. So imagine, for example, if your average, your chronic workload, your average workload over the past 3 weeks was 600, but your training load today was 1200.
Yeah.
What's the ratio? What's the output going to be then?
So the ratio would be 2.
Mm-hmm. And now you're above that threshold of 1.5. What's the problem?
Greater risk of injury.
That's right. That's why, and think back to what we talked about here. When is the moment where players are at the highest risk of injury throughout the week? What's the one time? There's only one day in the week that players are at the highest risk of injury. When is it?
Game day.
And why is that?
It's the highest load.
That's right. That's where you're going to get loads 800, 900, maybe over 1,000 if you count warm-ups and stuff, right? Or extra time, right? So that's the idea. Okay. So yeah, does it make sense?
It's starting to make sense. Now, where does this acute chronic workload ratio come from?
Well, so this is in the literature. It's something that's been researched a lot, but only for the last 4 or 5 years. It's relatively new. Okay.
Gotcha.
And the idea is that again, people, sports scientists, fitness coaches who have been checking and tracking training load, they want to say, okay, so training load, it isn't just important to look at it in isolation. You have to factor in how what's happening with training load over time. And that's the reason why examining the chronic workload over time relative to what you're doing now is better than just looking at what you're doing now in isolation.
That makes complete sense.
Makes sense? Yeah. I guess the best way to think of it is you're taking into account your players' fitness, right? How fit they are, what they've been doing over the last month, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're taking into account their fitness relative to what they're doing today.
Awesome.
If you want them to do more today, then you have to make sure that they're fit and they've planned and periodized to get there. So that's the idea. And again, as I said, I wanted to just give you some fake data because I knew we weren't going to get much real data. It's great that we got some from Andrew, but obviously next time I run this course, we're going to be all back to normal and we're going to look at real full data sets. So let's just finish with this now. And this is our man, David Beckham. Okay. So just some things that you're going to pluck out if and when you start collecting data. Okay. And again, keep in mind, we're looking at training load here, okay? Because you can look at his recovery if you're tracking recovery. You can look at hydration, but we're talking training load, and we've kind of color coded it to make it as simple as possible, okay? So first of all, you can see, week 16 and week 17. Why is it that week 17 in blue in the graph? Why is it that you have days 5, 6, and 7 are at a 0? Do you know why? Anybody?
No competition, vacation, injury.
It's because this particular graph is giving you day of the week, meaning Sunday to Saturday. So because it's Wednesday, we have only Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday from week 17 that's been recorded. Got it?
Oh, gotcha.
So in any case, it's one way to display it. I mean, to be honest with me and Sam, we kind of played around. How do we best want to display this? This gives you, if you were to look at it on Saturday, then you'd see the full picture of the week, of the full week. And if not, then you're going to see this kind of incomplete. But one thing you can see, what do you notice? And I'll stay with Max, right? Because Max is on a roll, right? So what do you notice about the first 4 days from 1 week to the next? Is there something that stands out to you?
Very consistent. So
there you go.
Your ACW, your acute chronic workload ratio would probably reflect that
Yeah,
one ratio, right?
It's going to stay very stagnant, and more or less over the course of a season, that's not such a bad thing. It means your weeks look pretty similar. There's a wave-like pattern, right? You know, we're kind of on the right track with that, right? If there's a big jump, you know, maybe it's okay, but not all the time. And keep in mind, you know, again, we've given you this other little feature here, which you know gives you, it's color coded. Okay, so green is good. Okay, and why is green good? Because you're in that range, right? These are all the, you know, the training sessions and even the game. Now you can see obviously the ACWR goes up in the game, right?
Yep.
The number is higher, but it's still within that range. So this is a good thing. Now, if the color goes to yellow or the color goes to red, then that means injury risk goes up. So that's kind of the idea here, is that it gives you, you know, I think a nice little simple, easy way to keep track of player by player what's going on. So you can, again, I mentioned if you wanted to look at groups of players or whatever, you can do that. You can also filter one player at a time. Okay, so you know, we're kind of running out of time. I'll say, I don't know if anyone else has any kind of questions or comments about this, you know, this individual player feature, and if not, then we'll wrap it up.
Richard, I'm gonna have to head out. My question is, well, so I haven't used it at all, right?
Yeah.
And know you sent us the, I can't remember. How do I find the code to send my team?
Okay, so if you go back to the emails that I sent you, this would have been an email that I sent to you right on the day of. So you got to, I guess, check your Outlook or whatever for March 31st. I believe it was that night that I sent them. So check your email there, and you will find in it. So there's you know, a link to the website, which is, you know, it's sportsrecoverytracker.com. So that's the site. And then you, what I gave you was a special, so you can create your own coach's account for free. So any coach can create a coach's account for free. So there's nothing particular there. But then what you want to do is you want to give your players the special access link that I gave you, which allows them to create a player account, and they don't have to pay, because normally creating an athlete account, you have to pay for it. But I've given you this, you know, this free basic, like a link that allows you to bypass the payment for it. And then once all your players have created their own athlete account, they also have to use the unique team code. And maybe if that's getting confusing, because it's I'm going to share. Do I have Sports Recovery Tracker?
I think I found it. Yeah.
Oh, you found it already. Okay, great. Well, let me just explain, because the other thing you need to give to your players in order for them to find, you know, to when they create their account, for them to create the account with your team, is this. See, I'm in Sports Recovery Tracker now. I'm scrolling to the bottom. You see here the team key.
Yep.
So when you have a coach's account, that's your team key. So essentially you have to give, and this, you know, we made a little document. You can email them the document, right? So you give them that document, teaches them how to set it up, and you give them the special link, which makes it free. Once all your players have an account, then they can track their data, or you as a coach can go into your team account, and I'll show you here. If I want to track training load, okay, I click fitness tracking and then training load, right? And I've got all my players in here. You would have all yours, and you can track it yourself if you want to do that. It's up to you.
Yeah. Awesome.
Does that make sense?
Looking forward to using it.
Right on. Great. Okay.
Can we add staff to this?
That's a good question. I have to look into it. I think you can. I don't want to, you know, say yes and
No problem.
and then get it thrown back. And maybe if you don't mind, even Max, just email me to follow up, and then we'll look into it. Yeah. We'll figure it out. If we can't do it now, we'll make it happen, because I know, I think maybe you're thinking if you want your assistant coach and some others as well. So but yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm sure there's a way to do it if it's not already set up that way. So.
That's awesome. Thank you very much, Richard, for this. It was good chatting with everyone. I'm sorry, I do have to go.
Oh, no worries, Max. Yeah. So, and thank you. You're welcome. And of course, thank you for your participation. And what I'll do now, I know because we're we're just a little past 4 o'clock, so I'll put my contact info back up here on the screen here. Okay, and I'll thank everybody again. As I said 3 weeks ago, that you definitely without your participation and your effort and your attendance, right? We can't do these things. So I'll thank you all again. That's how you can get in touch with me. I think John has his hand up. So John is our executive director from the NSCAC. So before we wrap things up, maybe John has something to say. John? I don't know if John is texting me now. No. Oh. Call when you're done. Oh yeah. Okay. I'll give John a call when I'm done here. So, just to finally wrap things up. So, as I mentioned, if you're an NSCAC member, you get, of course, you got access to this course for free, and you get the videos in our members area, members only section. All of you, even if you're not a member, some of you that registered for the course, I'll send you the link to this video separately, so you'll get that. You've already got all the PowerPoints and everything with Sports Recovery Tracker. The other offer that we've made through Best Athletes, that's the technology company that I'm partnered with, okay, is that we have a special 25% off discount for team fitness assessments. So whenever, the lockdown restrictions are lifted and we're able to set up a fitness assessment, we can set one up for you where you get tested. I'll come out to run the test with your team. You also get access to the Best Athletes platform, where you can look at data analytics. You can compare your team's results to all of the different standards and norms that I've got, from my 20-year career doing this work, and you get a lot of other really awesome, analytical data. You can see where your players are developmentally versus just chronologically. You can compare it to even the top levels and connect with coaches in those levels in university and professional. So in any case, you get a 25% off discount. I'll send you a special separate email about that. Thank you all again very much. And I guess I'll look forward to seeing you all soon online and maybe eventually also in person.
So I'm done.
Thanks, Richard. Great session.
All right.
I actually sorted it into boxes. So there's 3 boxes. I just put everything that was in each box. I can label the boxes too, but because they're not labeled yet, so so that they know exactly what's in each box.
Okay.
I don't know if someone else was unmuted here. All right. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
I'll put it with the boxes and
Have a good afternoon.
each box.
All right, then stick it in my van.
Okay.